contraction of smooth muscle is usually involuntary, and some smooth muscle tissue, such as the muscles that propel food through your gastrointestinal tract, have autorhythmicity. Both cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are regulated by neurons that are part of the autonomic or involuntary division of the nervous system and by hormones released by endocrine glands. Functions of muscular tissue. Through sustained contraction or alternating contraction and relaxation, muscle tissue has four key functions: producing body movements, stabilizing body positions, storing and moving substances within the body, and generating heat. Okay, that's making it too hard to concentrate, so I'm not going to do that anymore. It was worth a try though. 1. Producing body movements. Movements of the whole body, such as walking and running, and localized movements such as grasping a pencil, keyboarding, or nodding the head, is a result of muscular contractions, rely on the integrated functioning of skeletal muscles, bones, and joints. 2. Stabilizing body positions. Skeletal muscle contractions stabilize joints and help maintain body positions, such as standing or sitting. Postural muscles contract continuously when you are awake. For example, sustained contractions of your neck muscles hold your head upright when you are listening intently to your Anatomy and Physiology lecture. 3. Storing and moving substances within the body. Storage is accomplished by sustained contractions of ring-like bands of smooth muscle called sphincters, which prevent outflow of the contents of a hollow organ. Temporary storage of food in the stomach or urine in the urinary bladder is possible because smooth muscle sphincters close off the outlets of these organs. Cardiac muscle contractions of the heart pump blood through the blood vessels of the body. Contraction and relaxation of smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels help adjust blood vessel diameter around the muscle fibers. Oh wait, I read that already. An example is the calcaneal or Achilles tendon of the gastrocnemius or calf muscle, which attaches the muscle to the calcaneus, which is the heel bone. When the connective tissue elements extend as a broad, flat sheet, it is called an aponeurosis. An example is the epicranial aponeurosis on top of the skull between the frontal and occipital bellies of the occipitofrontalis muscle. There's a picture of some muscles. The stuff I just talked about. Nerve and blood supply. Skeletal muscles are well supplied with nerves and blood vessels. Generally, an artery and one or two veins accompany each nerve that penetrates a skeletal muscle. The neurons that stimulate skeletal muscle to contract are somatic motor neurons. Somatic motor neurons, rather. Each somatic motor neuron has a thread-like axon that extends from the that extends from the brain or spinal cord to a group of skeletal muscle fibers. The axon of a somatic motor neuron typically branches many times, each branch extending to a different skeletal muscle fiber. Microscopic blood vessels called capillaries are plentiful in muscular tissue. Each muscle fiber is in close contact with one or more capillaries. The blood capillaries bring in oxygen and nutrients and remove heat and the waste products of muscle metabolism. Muscle poop. Especially during contraction, a muscle fiber synthesizes and uses considerable ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. These reactions, which you will learn more about later on, require oxygen, glucose, fatty acids, and other substances that are delivered to the muscle fiber in the blood. I feel like that's supposed to be by the blood. Microscopic anatomy of a skeletal muscle fiber. The most important components of a skeletal muscle are the muscle fibers themselves. The diameter of a mature skeletal muscle fiber ranges from 10 to 100 micrometers. The typical length of a mature skeletal muscle fiber is about 10 centimeters, although some are as long as 30 centimeters. Because each skeletal muscle fiber arises during embryonic development from the fusion of 100 or more small mesodermal cells called myoblasts, each mature skeletal muscle fiber has 100 or more nuclei. Once fusion has occurred, the muscle fiber loses its ability to undergo cell division. Thus, the number of skeletal muscle fibers is set before you were born, and most of these cells last a lifetime. Sarcolemma, transverse tubules, and sarcoplasm. The multiple nuclei of a skeletal muscle fiber are located just beneath the sarcolemma, the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. Thousands of tiny invaginations of the sarcolemma, called transverse tubules, tunnel in from the surface toward the center of each muscle fiber. Because T tubules are open to the outside of the fiber, they are filled with interstitial fluid. Muscle action potentials travel along the sarcolemma and through the T tubules, quickly spreading throughout the muscle fiber. This arrangement ensures that an action potential excites all part of the muscle fiber at essentially the same instant. Within the sarcolemma is the sarcoplasm, the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber. Sarcoplasm includes a substantial amount of glycogen, which is a large molecule composed of many glucose molecules. Glycogen can be used for synthesis of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. In addition, the sarcoplasm contains a red-colored protein called myoglobin. This protein, found only in muscle, binds oxygen molecules that diffuse into muscle fibers from interstitial fluid. Myoglobin releases oxygen when it is needed by the mitochondria for ATP production. The mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, lie in rows throughout the muscle fiber, strategically close to the filaments are 16 nanometers in diameter and 1 to 2 micrometers long and composed mostly of the protein myosin. Both thin and thick filaments are directly involved in the... That was a lot of mouth sounds. Both thin and thick filaments are directly involved in the contractile process. Overall, there are 2 thin filaments for every thick filament in the regions of filament overlap. The filaments inside a microfibril lesson